The early morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Harold Thompson, a 93-year-old World War II veteran, carefully combed his silver hair in front of his bathroom mirror. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, just as they had done every morning for the past several decades. The small house on Maple Street was quiet, save for the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from his late wife Martha. At exactly 7:15 a.m., Harold put on his favorite navy blue sweater, the one Martha had given him for their last Christmas together. He walked slowly to his garage, his polished black shoes making soft sounds against the concrete floor. There sat his pride and joy. A 1985 Buick Regal, its dark green paint still gleaming despite its age. Harold maintained it perfectly, just as he had maintained his military equipment during the war. "Another beautiful morning, old friend," he said softly to the car, patting its hood gently. This was their daily conversation, him and the last car he and Martha had bought together. He remembered how she had insisted on the green color, saying it matched his eyes. The memory made him smile, even though it had been 5 years since she passed away. The drive to Joe's Corner Cafe took exactly 12 minutes. Harold knew every turn, every stop sign, and even the timing of each traffic light. He would park in the same spot every day, the third space from the entrance, where the morning sun wouldn't make the car too hot for his drive home. The spot had become unofficially his. Even the other regular customers knew it. As Harold pushed open the cafe's glass door, the familiar bell chimed above his head. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled his nostrils, making his stomach rumble quietly. Sarah, the morning waitress with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up from behind the counter and smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out, already reaching for his favorite blue coffee mug. "The usual today?" Harold nodded, settling into his regular booth by the window. The vinyl seat had a small crack on the left side that he knew by heart. "Yes, please, Sarah, and maybe an extra slice of toast today. I'm feeling adventurous," he said with a gentle wink. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, creating patterns on the worn Formica tabletop. Harold pulled out his reading glasses and the day's newspaper from his brown leather bag, the same one he carried to work for 30 years at the post office after returning from the war. Around him, the diner buzzed with its morning routine. Tom, the cook, hummed old country songs while flipping pancakes. The coffee machine hissed and gurgled, providing a steady background rhythm. Young parents rushed in with children in school uniforms, grabbing quick breakfasts before the day began. Business people in suits stopped for coffee to go, their phones constantly buzzing. But for Harold, time moved slower here. Each sip of coffee was savored, each bite of toast carefully buttered. He read every article in the newspaper, even the classified ads, occasionally sharing interesting news with Sarah when she came to refill his cup. Sometimes, he would solve the crossword puzzle, using the same pencil he'd had since Martha gave him a stationery set for their 40th anniversary. The other regulars, Mike the plumber, Betty from the flower shop, and old Jim who used to teach at the high school, would wave or stop by his booth for a quick chat. They had all become his second family over the years, filling the quiet spaces that Martha's passing had left behind. In this small corner of Springfield, Harold had found his sanctuary, a place where memories of the past blended comfortably with the present, and where every morning brought the simple joy of familiar faces and quiet moments. The peaceful routine at Joe's Corner Cafe changed on a warm Tuesday morning in May. The familiar sound of the door chime was drowned out by the loud rumble of motorcycle engines. 6 large bikes pulled into the parking lot, their chrome parts shining in the morning sun. The riders wore black leather jackets with a silver snake design on the back. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she poured Harold's coffee. Through the window, they watched as the bikers parked their motorcycles in a semicircle around Harold's green Buick. Their leader, a tall man with a thick black beard and arms covered in tattoos, walked in first. The silver chain on his boots made a clicking sound against the cafe floor. "Name's Razor," he announced loudly to no one in particular, dropping heavily into a booth near the counter. His 5 friends followed, their leather jackets creaking as they sat down. The usual morning chatter in the cafe died down to whispers. Even Tom stopped humming in the kitchen. The bikers ordered their breakfast in loud voices, making jokes about the old-fashioned menu. When Betty from the flower shop accidentally bumped into one of them while leaving, they laughed roughly, causing her to hurry out with her face red. Harold watched quietly from behind his newspaper, his hands steady as he turned the pages. This new group started coming to the cafe every morning around 8:30 a.m., just when Harold usually finished his breakfast. They seemed to enjoy making the small diner their territory. They would spread out their maps on their tables, planning their rides in loud voices that made it hard for others to talk. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust began to mix with the usual coffee and bacon smells of the cafe. What bothered Harold most was how they treated his car. Each day, they parked their bikes closer and closer to his Buick, leaving barely enough space for him to open his car door. When he carefully tried to squeeze between their motorcycles, they would watch from inside the cafe, nudging each other and smirking. Need a magnifying glass to find your car, old-timer? Razor called out one morning, causing his friends to laugh. Harold's hands gripped his car keys tighter, but his face remained calm. He remembered facing worse situations in the war, though this kind of disrespect still stung. Sarah tried to help by asking them politely to leave more space, but they just ignored her. Tom, the cook, wanted to say something too, but the cafe owner worried about starting trouble. The bikers were big spenders, ordering large breakfasts and staying for hours. Other regular customers started changing their schedules. Old Jim began coming an hour earlier. Betty from the flower shop switched to getting coffee to go. The morning peace that Harold had enjoyed for so many years was disappearing. The crossword puzzles became harder to focus on with the constant loud talking and rough laughter. One morning, Razor walked past Harold's table, deliberately bumping it hard enough to spill his coffee. "Oops," he said with a mean smile, not even pretending it was an accident. "Guess your reflexes aren't what they used to be, Cramps." Harold quietly used his napkin to clean up the spill, his movements precise and controlled, just as they had been when he cleaned his rifle in the war. He noticed how Razor's hands had dirt under the fingernails, how his swagger was a bit too forceful, like he was trying too hard to be tough. Harold had seen this type before, during the war and after. People who tried to make themselves feel bigger by making others feel small. The other customers watched helplessly as this scene played out day after day. The warm, friendly atmosphere of Joe's Corner Cafe was changing into something tense and uncomfortable. But Harold, who had survived a world war and lost his beloved Martha, wasn't going to give up his morning routine without a fight, though not the kind of fight the bikers might expect. Harold sat in his living room one evening, looking through his old military album. His fingers traced over a yellowed photograph of his unit from 1944. They had been in France then, preparing for a difficult mission. His commander had taught him something valuable. Sometimes the best strategy is to watch and wait. Following this old wisdom, Harold began paying careful attention to everything happening at the cafe. Each morning, he would arrive at his usual time, but now his newspaper wasn't just for reading. Behind those pages, his sharp eyes noticed things others missed. He watched how Razor always sat where he could see his reflection in the cafe's window, fixing his hair when he thought no one was looking. Harold noticed how the youngest biker, probably only 20 years old, flinched whenever Razor raised his voice. He saw how another biker named Snake would secretly leave extra tips for Sarah when his friends weren't watching. At home, Harold started keeping a small notebook, just like he did during the war. He wrote down what he observed. Tuesday, Razor checks his phone every 5 minutes, seems worried. Wednesday, the young one, Tommy, has a college textbook in his bike bag. Thursday, Snake helps an old lady with her car door when others aren't around. The harassment continued, but Harold stayed calm. When they blocked his car in with their bikes, he would patiently wait, using the time to study their behavior. When they made loud jokes about his age, he kept his face neutral, remembering how his war training taught him that reaction was exactly what bullies wanted. Sarah worried about him. One morning, while refilling his coffee, she whispered, "Mr. Thompson, we could call the police." Harold just smiled and patted her hand gently. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the best battles are won without firing a shot." The other regular customers dealt with the situation differently. Mike the plumber started coming in wearing his work boots, hoping to look tough. Betty from the flower shop brought her large son with her one day, but even that didn't help. Old Jim simply stopped coming altogether, sending Harold a sad note saying he would miss their morning chats. Harold felt the weight of everyone's fear and disappointment. He saw how Tom's cheerful cooking songs had stopped, how Sarah's hands trembled slightly when serving the bikers, how the morning sunlight seemed less bright with all the tension in the air. but his military training had taught him patience. He remembered long nights in France, waiting in complete silence, knowing that rushing into action would only make things worse. One morning, Harold noticed something interesting. An older woman came into the cafe, and Razor quickly turned his face away, sinking lower in his seat. Harold watched through his newspaper as the woman left, and saw how Razor's tough expression cracked for just a moment, showing something that looked like sadness. That evening, Harold added this observation to his notebook. Then he pulled out his old military maps from the war, spreading them on his kitchen table. Planning and strategy had kept him and his unit alive during the darkest days of the war. Now, at 93, he was using those same skills again, but for a different kind of battle. Before going to bed, Harold looked at Martha's picture on his nightstand. "You always said I was too patient," he whispered to her smiling image. "But I learned in the war that understanding your opponent is more important than confronting them. These young men are fighting something, Martha. I just need to figure out what it is." As he turned out the light, Harold felt strangely peaceful. Tomorrow would bring more harassment, more challenging moments at the cafe, but he was doing what he did best, observing, planning, and waiting for the right moment. Just as he had done all those years ago, when the stakes were life and death, and patience had kept him alive. Part 4. The breaking point. The rain fell steadily that Thursday morning, forming small rivers on Joe's Corner Cafe's windows. Harold arrived at his usual time, holding his old black umbrella, the one Martha had insisted he always keep in the car. The parking lot was empty except for his green Buick, sitting quietly in its usual spot. As Harold walked toward the cafe entrance, something caught his eye. The morning was dark because of the rain, so he moved closer to his car to see better. His heart, which had stayed steady through bombs and bullets in the war, skipped a beat. There, scratched deep into the green paint of his beloved Buick, were the crude words, "Old Ty and the Argo Ho Me." The scratches ran along the entire passenger side, the metal gleaming silver where the paint had been scraped away. Below it, someone had drawn what looked like a snake, Razor's gang symbol. Harold's hands began to shake, not from fear, but from a deeper pain. This wasn't just any car. This was the last car he and Martha had chosen together. He remembered that day clearly. Martha's eyes lighting up at the dark green color, her laugh when she said it matched his army uniform. They had driven this car to their grandson's graduation, to their 50th wedding anniversary party, and finally to the hospital on Martha's last day. Sarah came running out of the cafe with an umbrella when she saw Harold standing in the rain. "Oh my God, Mr. Thompson," she gasped, seeing the damage. "I'll call the police right now." But Harold gently placed his hand on her arm, stopping her. The rain ran down his face, but he didn't seem to notice. His mind was somewhere else, back in France, 1944, when his unit had faced a seemingly impossible situation. His commander had told him something he never forgot. The worst thing you can do is let anger cloud your judgment. Inside the cafe, everyone noticed something different about Harold that morning. He sat in his usual booth, but instead of his newspaper, he took out his small notebook. His hands were completely steady now as he wrote. Tom brought him his usual coffee and toast without being asked, and for the first time in weeks, Harold didn't touch either. "Those animals," Betty whispered from the next booth, tears in her eyes. "How could they do this to your beautiful car?" Harold looked up from his notebook and smiled gently. "Sometimes, Betty," he said quietly, "people do cruel things because they're hurting inside." He remembered saying similar words to young soldiers in his unit who wanted to retaliate against local civilians who had been hostile to them. As the morning went on, other regulars came in, saw the car, and offered help. Mike the plumber knew someone who could fix the paint for cheap. Old Jim called to say he would drive Harold anywhere he needed to go. Even Tom offered to stay late and help Harold wash the car. But Harold had a different plan forming in his mind. Just like in the war, when a direct attack wouldn't work, you had to find another way. He pulled out an old photograph from his wallet, one he carried since 1945. It showed his unit standing in front of a bombed-out building in France, smiling despite their circumstances. Looking at the young faces in the photo, Harold remembered how they had overcome their challenges not through force, but through understanding and strategy. Now, sitting in his quiet booth while the rain continued outside, he felt that same calm focus he had felt back then. Sarah refilled his untouched coffee cup, her eyes worried. What are you going to do, Mr. Thompson? Harold carefully put the photograph back in his wallet and closed his notebook. I'm going to win this battle, Sarah, he said softly, but not in the way they expect. His voice had the quiet confidence of a man who had faced worse odds and emerged victorious. Harold spent the next few days watching and learning, just as he had done on reconnaissance missions during the war. He arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, parking his scratched Buick where he could see the street clearly. In his notebook, he started writing down everything he noticed about the bikers' routines. They always arrived at 8:30 a.m., except on Wednesdays when they came at 9 o'clock. Harold figured out this was because the gas station around the corner gave free motorcycle checks on Wednesday mornings. He noticed how Razor would stare at his phone before the others arrived, as if waiting for important messages. One quiet morning, Harold overheard Snake talking about their weekend rides. We always take Route 27 past the old Veterans Cemetery, Snake had said. This caught Harold's attention. That cemetery was where many World War II veterans were buried, including some of his old friends. Sarah helped Harold without knowing it. She loved to talk while refilling coffee cups, and the bikers often forgot she was listening. Razor's been different since his dad passed, she told Harold one morning, keeping her voice low. His real name's Kevin Mitchell. His father used to come here years ago, before you started coming, Mr. Thompson. This information made Harold sit up straighter. Mitchell. He knew that name. His mind went back to a cold night in France, 1944. A young soldier named James Mitchell had saved their entire unit by warning them about an enemy attack. Harold had never forgotten that night. That evening, instead of watching his usual evening news, Harold went into his study. He pulled out old boxes of military records he had kept all these years. His hands moved carefully through yellowed papers and old photographs until he found what he was looking for, a unit photograph from 1944. There, standing next to him, was a young James Mitchell, smiling broadly at the camera. Harold used his magnifying glass to study the photo carefully. James Mitchell had the same strong jaw as Razor, the same way of holding his head. But James's eyes had been kind, full of purpose. Razor's eyes looked lost, angry. The next morning, Harold asked Tom, the cook, some careful questions. Tom knew everyone in town and liked to talk. Oh yeah, old Jim Mitchell, Tom said while flipping pancakes. Passed away 2 months ago. His son Kevin took it real hard. Started hanging out with those bikers right after the funeral. Harold wrote in his notebook, Kevin Razor Mitchell, James Mitchell's son. Lost his father 2 months ago. Looking for something to prove? He noticed other things too, how the young biker, Tommy, would read college textbooks when he thought no one was watching. How Snake would make phone calls during breaks, speaking softly to someone he called sweetheart. Even the biggest, toughest-looking biker had a small photo of a little girl in his wallet, probably his daughter. These weren't just bullies, Harold realized. They were lost men, trying to find their place in the world, just like many young soldiers he had known in the war. Harold spent an afternoon at the local library, using their computer with help from the kind librarian. He found James Mitchell's obituary. It mentioned his war service, his work at the local factory, and his son Kevin. The obituary said James had earned the Silver Star for bravery in World War II, but Kevin hadn't known much about his father's service. James, like many veterans, hadn't talked much about the war. That night, Harold sat in his favorite chair, looking at the old photograph of James Mitchell. He remembered how James had once told him, sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, it's reaching out to others. Now, all these years later, Harold had a chance to reach out to James's son. He opened his notebook and began writing his plan. This wouldn't be like the strategic plans he made in the war, with maps and combat tactics. This would be a different kind of strategy, one built on understanding, connection, and the shared bond between soldiers across generations. The next Monday morning dawned clear and bright. Harold dressed with extra care, putting on his old military tie clip that he rarely wore anymore. In his worn leather briefcase, alongside his usual newspaper, he placed the photo album he had spent all weekend preparing. When he walked into Joe's Corner Cafe, Sarah noticed something different about him. His shoulders were straight, his steps sure, just like in the old photographs of him in uniform. She started to bring his usual coffee, but he shook his head. Not yet, Sarah, he said quietly. I'll need a bigger table today. He chose a large booth near where the bikers usually sat. At 8:30 a.m., Right on schedule, the motorcycles roared into the parking lot. Harold could feel the tension rise in the cafe as the bikers walked in, their boots heavy on the floor. Razor led the group, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. The cafe fell silent as Harold stood up. Everyone watched, worried, as the old veteran walked steadily toward the bikers' table. Even Razor seemed surprised by this direct approach. "Kevin Mitchell," Harold said clearly, using Razor's real name. The biker leader's eyes widened with surprise. "I served with your father in France." Before Razor could respond, Harold placed the photo album on their table. His hands were steady as he opened it to the first page. There, in a clear plastic sleeve, was the photograph of James Mitchell and Harold standing together, young and strong in their uniforms. "Your father saved my life," Harold continued, his voice strong and clear, "and the lives of 20 other men on a cold night in 1944. The other bikers leaned in, curious. Razor's tough expression flickered as he stared at the young man in the photograph, his father, looking barely older than he was now. Harold turned another page, revealing more photos. "This is where we were stationed in France. Your father used to tell us jokes in the evenings to keep our spirits up." He pointed to another picture. "And here, this was taken the day after he earned his Silver Star." "Silver Star?" Razor's voice was different now, softer, more like Kevin than the tough biker leader he pretended to be. "Dad never told me about a Silver Star. Many of us found it hard to talk about the war," Harold explained gently. "But your father was a hero. He heard enemy soldiers approaching our camp one night. Instead of just raising the alarm, he crept out alone to confirm their positions. The information he brought back saved our entire unit." Sarah brought coffee for everyone without being asked. The other cafe customers watched in amazed silence as Harold sat down with the bikers. His voice was soft but clear as he shared story after story about James Mitchell. "Your father loved motorcycles too," Harold mentioned, turning to another page. There was a photo of James sitting on an old military motorcycle, grinning at the camera. "He used to volunteer to run messages between units because he loved riding those old bikes." Razor, Kevin, touched the photograph gently. His usual tough mask had cracked completely now. "I never knew," he said quietly. "Dad never talked about any of this." Harold nodded understandingly. "War changes you, makes some memories too hard to share. But your father was one of the finest men I ever knew. He taught me that true strength isn't about intimidating others. It's about protecting them." The other bikers sat quietly, their usual rowdy behavior forgotten as they looked through the album. Snake removed his sunglasses, wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The youngest one, Tommy, looked at the photos with obvious respect. "I see him in you," Harold said softly to Kevin. "You have his same strong spirit. You would be proud of that spirit, but he'd want you to use it the way he did, to help others, not to frighten them." The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow over the unlikely group gathered around the old photo album. Kevin Razor Mitchell sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of a photograph showing his father receiving the Silver Star Medal. "There's something else you should know," Harold said, his voice gentle as he turned to the last pages of the album. He pulled out an old, carefully preserved letter, the paper yellow with age. "Your father wrote this to me a month before he passed away." The cafe was completely silent now. Even Tom had stopped cooking to watch. Kevin's hands trembled slightly as he took the letter from Harold. "Dear Harold," Kevin read aloud, his voice cracking. "I never told Kevin about my time in the war. Maybe that was a mistake, but I see him struggling now, trying to find his way in the world. If anything happens to me, could you share our stories with him? He needs to know where he comes from, what his name means." Kevin stopped reading, his eyes filling with tears. The tough biker leader was gone, replaced by a son discovering his father's legacy. The other bikers sat in respectful silence, their usual rowdy behavior forgotten. Harold reached into his briefcase and pulled out one more item, a small box covered in faded blue velvet. "Your father wanted you to have this," he said, placing it in Kevin's hands. "He gave it to me for safekeeping last year." Inside the box was James Mitchell's Silver Star Medal, still shining after all these years. Attached was a small note in James's handwriting. "For my son Kevin, who I hope will find the same courage and peace that I found in war." Snake, who usually acted as Kevin's tough right-hand man, spoke up softly. My old man was in Vietnam, he said. Never talked about it either. Passed away before I could really understand why. One by one, the other bikers shared their own stories. Tommy, the youngest, admitted his father had died in Afghanistan when he was just a kid. The big biker with the daughter revealed his grandfather had been at Pearl Harbor. It seemed they had all been carrying their own hidden connections to service and sacrifice. Sarah brought a fresh pot of coffee, her eyes moist as she listened to the stories. The regular customers, who had been watching from their tables, began sharing their own family histories of service. Old Jim, who had come in despite his fear of the bikers, talked about his brother who never came home from Korea. Harold watched as the cafe transformed. The invisible walls between people began to crumble. Betty from the flower shop brought over fresh muffins for everyone. Mike the plumber shared stories about his uncle who had served in the Navy. Kevin held the silver star in his hand, looking at it with new understanding. I've been angry, he admitted quietly to Harold. When Dad died, it felt like I lost my chance to really know him. I thought being tough, being feared, would somehow make up for feeling lost. Harold nodded knowingly. Your father felt lost too, when we came home from the war, he said. But he found his way by helping others, by being strong for his family and community. That's the real legacy he wanted to leave you. The morning stretched on, but nobody seemed to want to leave. The bikers removed their heavy leather jackets in the warm cafe, revealing regular men underneath, sons, brothers, fathers themselves. They listened intently as Harold shared more stories about their father's generation, about the bonds formed in difficult times, and about the different kinds of courage it takes to live a good life. Tom started cooking again, making enough breakfast for everyone. The smell of coffee and bacon mixed with the sounds of conversation and occasional laughter. The harsh fluorescent lights of the cafe seemed softer somehow, as if the past and present had merged in this moment of understanding. The next morning, Harold drove toward Joe's Corner Cafe as usual. But something was different. As he turned into the parking lot, he saw 5 motorcycles lined up neatly on either side of his regular parking spot. The space itself was empty, waiting for his green Buick. Kevin Razor Mitchell stood by the cafe door, no longer wearing his leather jacket. Instead, he had on a clean blue work shirt with Mitchell Auto Body printed on the pocket. As Harold parked his car, Kevin walked over, holding a cup of coffee made exactly the way Harold liked it. Good morning, sir, Kevin said respectfully. I hope you don't mind, but we fixed your car last night. Harold looked at his Buick and saw that the scratches were gone. The green paint shone in the morning sun, looking almost new. Inside the cafe, everything had changed. The bikers still sat at their usual table, but now they greeted other customers with friendly nods. Snake had helped Betty carry in her flower deliveries. Tommy, the youngest biker, was showing old Jim how to use a smartphone to video chat with his grandchildren. Sarah moved between tables with a bright smile, no longer afraid. Tom's cheerful humming filled the kitchen again as he cooked breakfast. The morning sunlight seemed warmer somehow, as if the cafe itself was happier. Kevin joined Harold in his booth, carefully placing his father's Silver Star medal on the table between them. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he told Harold. About Dad's legacy. I want to do something that would make him proud. He explained that he and the other bikers had started a new tradition. Every Sunday, they would ride to the Veterans Cemetery where James Mitchell and other veterans were buried. They would clean the headstones, place flowers, and help maintain the grounds. We're also starting a motorcycle club for veterans. Snake added from the next table. Giving them rides to appointments, helping with groceries, that kind of thing. His voice was gentle now, matching the kind heart that Harold had noticed early on. The changes spread beyond the cafe. Word got around town about how the group of bikers had transformed. More veterans started coming to Joe's Corner Cafe, sharing their own stories. The bikers listened respectfully, learning about different wars, different generations, but the same courage and sacrifice. Tommy had enrolled in college full-time, studying to become a counselor for veterans. He still wore his leather vest, but now it had a new patch that read Veterans First. The big biker with the daughter had started bringing her to the cafe on Saturday mornings, teaching her about respect and community. One morning, Kevin brought in an old motorcycle he had found, the same model his father had ridden in the war. He and Harold spent hours looking at it, with Harold sharing stories about how James Mitchell had kept the military bikes running even in the worst conditions. The regulars at the cafe formed new friendships. Betty's flower shop now had a special discount for veterans. Mike the plumber offered free services to elderly veterans who needed help. Old Jim started a weekly veterans coffee group, where stories and wisdom were shared across generations. Harold's quiet strategy had worked better than anyone could have imagined. Instead of fighting fire with fire, he had used understanding and connection to transform enemies into friends. The cafe had become more than just a place to eat. It was a place where the past and present came together, where tough exteriors melted away to reveal the good hearts beneath. On special occasions, like Veterans Day or Memorial Day, Kevin would wear his father's silver star. But he didn't need the medal to stand tall anymore. He had found a different kind of strength, the kind his father and Harold had shown in war and peace. The scratched car that had marked the lowest point had led to the greatest change. Harold would sometimes look at his restored Buick and smile, remembering Martha's words. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to shine a light. His military strategy of patience, observation, and understanding had won a victory greater than any battle. It had won hearts and changed lives.